Welcome back to Dylan's World podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Enjoy the show. Okay, Bea Gonzalez, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me on.
Of course. So I got introduced to your work through your Instagram page, actually. I want to use that as a starting point. For transparency's sake, I dove into your work and some of the podcasts you've done, but I was trying to think of how to plan for this, but I was like, let me just go with it because I'm a fan of Jung, I'm a fan of yours. I'm like,
right.
let's try to wing this a little bit and see where consciousness takes us. So how did you get started with the Sophia Cycles Instagram? Because again, that's where I was introduced to your work just by reading all these quotes that you were posting. And
Right. So years and years ago, I think 2011, I started on Twitter. And I have had a Sophia group for many, many years, maybe going back to 2008. And one thing that occurred to me when the social media exploded is just how much noise there was of a nature that it wasn't really calming to anybody or taking anybody a little bit deeper. And so the whole purpose of my group, when I formed the Sophia group, was that it was kind of me looking for people to discuss meaning issues with, going a little bit deeper than, the typical conversation we all have around the dinner table, which is honestly very boring, or I was finding it very boring. I was at that point in my life. And so I gathered this incredible group of people to me that included a lot of visual artists, a lot of writers, just people who were seeking the way that I was. And I had done some Jungian analysis, quite a bit of it, and I had at some point contemplated becoming a Jungian analyst myself. That's actually what everybody does, by the way. They go to Jungian analysis, then 2 minutes later, I'm going to be a Jungian analyst. But my own analyst, the one that I really worked a lot with, said, Bea, what we need are people who can work with groups, who can work in different types of situations. And she knew I really wasn't into, I was still publishing novels. I had young children, it didn't make any sense. And so I started that group. And the social media work was basically, it evolved from that group. So one of the things I do is I'm a ridiculous reader. And when I say that, all my life, the reason I dropped out of my PhD program was because I didn't have the discipline to read in one subject long enough. And I thought I'm not going to make it. And I read pretty widely. But from the point I started Jungian analysis, I really, really dove deep into the Jungian world and discovered all sorts of people, as you probably have, who were writing in that world and who were taking me to so many places that I really wanted to be in. And that I think my whole impetus for starting this was to take other people along with me. There were plenty of people pontificating, giving their ideas. My idea was I'm going to share my reading life with people and just take excerpts from books that I think are really impacting me and see where it goes. And that's what I started doing. And bizarrely, I never would have thought this. I cannot believe how many people wanted to follow those, like from Twitter, and then went on Instagram. Now I'm everywhere. I'm Threads, Blue Sky, everywhere. And, a lot of people talk about leaving one place or leaving the other. My view of this is we can all contribute anywhere we are to the conversation by offering something different, by offering a different type of conversation. And my conversation isn't, I now do have a couple of podcasts and I obviously continue to write, but really the conversation is about engaging with other ideas and ideas put forth by people who have made a really big change in my life. It really made me think about things in ways that I had not thought of before. And so that's how it all started. And I am as surprised as you probably are that somebody actually once sent me a note and they said, "Hey, how the heck are you getting all these followers? You just posting quotes." And I said, "I have absolutely no idea. I don't know." And it's just, I don't know.
That seems like the best way to do it, though. You're just doing what you're authentically interested in. You're sharing stuff that other people hopefully are authentically interested in. And it's cool. So for the listeners, it's Sophia Cycles is your Instagram.
Yeah.
And I'll put that in the show notes. But I resonate with that because I feel like some of these Jungian authors, when you start to dive into that kind of work, it speaks to a piece of you that a lot of the other world is not speaking to, even in other psychological realms. And I want to hear you speak on this because you're also a fiction author. You posted something the other day about language and story. Can you elaborate on that? I think it's very important that people understand that the power of language and narrative.
So to me, that is the question of the age. Are you familiar with Ian McGilchrist, his work, The
Mm.
Master and His Emissary? I think he may be the most important thinker of the time. And I don't say that lightly because I actually read a lot of people, but I do think he is the author of The Master and His Emissary. He basically looks at brain lateralization and how
Mm.
we are exposed to different ways of seeing things. So he takes apart all the idea of right brain, left brain. That it's not what we think it is. It's the way we pay attention given whatever side of the brain we're talking about. And one of his major theory is that we're living in a left brain dominated world, which sees the part but not the whole, right?
Mm.
It doesn't have context. And when you don't have context, you make a lot of decisions that are actually quite harmful to yourself and to others. We need that discerning, very specific view of the world, but we also need the larger context in which to place it. So he's quite worried about this. And because he is just this mega, like he's a psychiatrist who also had a PhD in literature from Oxford. I mean, he's so vast and the wealth of knowledge is incredible. And so I found him and I started thinking about why fiction, I've always thought fiction matters, otherwise I wouldn't be writing it. But if you go into my YouTube channel, which is also Sophia Psychos, I used to do, and I'm going to get back to that hopefully soon, I used to do little analyses of classical works, which is something I've always been interested in, and fairy tales, which is something the Jungian world is very interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that they matter is I think narrative is a right brain concern. Stories, they sort of take the parts and they're able to create context and they're able to create connection. And I think I read all these books that would seem academic, like all the books, wonderful books produced by Inner City Books, the publisher here in Toronto that does a lot of the Jungian analyst work. But I think story, and we know this through film or whatever, can take you one step further in ways that, because it touches the feeling state, right? One thing is I can read theory, and theory is fabulous. And obviously I'm a big fan of all of these writers. But when I hear a story, I'm taken to places that are much deeper. And so to me, the reason that Marie-Louise Von-Fronz, who was, as you probably well know, was one of the big Jungian, the first generation Jungians who actually worked with Jung from a very young age. And her specialty became fairy tales. And fairy tales in specifically, I had this question of, I did this book group the other day and I talked about the frog prince, right? And so I said the question, so there were about 4 women and some men, but mostly women. I says, okay, so how does the frog prince end? Do you know how the frog prince ends? So they all said the same thing, which is really interesting to me. They all said with a kiss. The frog prince.
Well, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Except that's not the real ending. That ending is the Disney-fied ending. So the real ending, and this is why it's important to know this, the real ending of the Frog Prince is that, she very, very quickly, this girl is playing around. She has this golden ball, which of course always symbolizes wholeness, and she loses it in a pond and she distresses. And the only thing that can help her is this little frog that comes out and says, hey, I'll help you. But in exchange, you have to marry me. And she's so desperate to get the ball back, her wholeness back, that she says, yeah, whatever. Of course, she gets it back and then she runs away from him. And he shows up at her door, and the father, who basically is all about law, as fathers generally represent, law and order, says, no, you've promised. So you must really now, show up for him. So anyway, this frog sits and has dinner with her and drives her crazy because, she doesn't want to be sitting next to a slurping frog. And at the end of the dinner, he follows her to the bedroom, right? Imagine having this slimy thing following you. As soon as he gets into the bedroom with her, she closes the door. And in the version that a lot of people have heard, she kisses the frog and then he becomes the prince, right? No, that's not the story. As soon as she closes the door, she makes sure nobody's listening. She takes the frog by one of the legs and slams it right against the wall. And when that happens, the prince shows up. Then the kiss can happen. So why is it important to keep that story the way it is and not the other? Because I think those stories speak to a lot of our fairy tales. Are probably 70% are aimed at the biggest transition we make as humans, which is to adolescence into adulthood, right? It's trying to show the feminine, which is in both men and women, that you need proper boundaries, right? Kissing isn't a boundary. Kissing is integration that happens once the boundary is established. So what she's doing by flinging the frog, which is what I call it, is fundamentally saying, you're not crossing here. And if we teach young men and women that boundaries are important at all times to be setting them, then that's one of the big lessons of adolescence. If you don't teach that, then you have all sorts of problems that evolve from that and lots of misinterpretations. So just taking a silly little story that everybody, has seen it on cartoons or whatever,
Mm.
it's actually really profound, and they're very old. Some of these go thousands of years. So Marie-Louise Von-Fronz started looking at these cross-culturally and thought, oh my God, there's a lot of wisdom in here. So and so she dissected them. And we have all these great books that are really her lectures, and she was phenomenal. I tell people, please go on YouTube and find her speaking. She was direct and just
Mm.
extremely charismatic. And she brought these things to light and to life in a way that we hadn't considered before, because I think we all sit around and go, oh, it's a fairy tale. But think about this, like how many people were really worried about the ending to the Game of Thrones? Do you remember that whole thing? Everybody was
Mhm.
crazed, and then how many people got upset when they didn't get the right ending? That is how story affects us. It's much
Mm.
more than I think any nonfiction book can ever do. I just don't think it has the same reach.
Yeah, I think we on to that point. I think we are made of story, and then it's very built into like the Native American traditions. And that when I actually spoke to someone recently, because I live in Arizona, so I was
Oh,
speaking
yeah.
with a native, and his family seems still very connected to their roots, whereas not everyone is. And his recall and his ability to share stories from the history of their people was phenomenal.
Yes. Yeah.
Besides the besides the point, but I find that when I was introduced to some of these mythological and stories or fairy tales, they really resonated within me. And one of the first people I listened to on podcasts speak about it was actually Jordan Peterson. And people, some people don't like him. Regardless, he was one of the first people that's like fascinated me with his ability to tell stories from an archetypal lens. So my question to you is essentially, well, first of all, I'm curious where this started. Did this start with your interest in literature, or did this start with
Hmm.
an interest in psychology? And kind of, I just want to go backward, just so instead of talking, instead of going right into the work, I'm just curious where you came into the work. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I think for me it was when I was very young. So I emigrated to Canada from Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when I came to Canada, one of the things that we had in Canada that didn't seem to exist in Spain, which was amazing for me, were great libraries. I spent a lot of my time in the library. And I think
Mm-hmm.
I'm one of those kids, and I think you probably know, or maybe are one, that basically read all the books in the children's section way before I was a teen. So I was promoted early to the teen section out of desperation. So stories have always been the way that I understand the world and the way that I engage with the world. And I could, honestly and I do spend most of my days reading. So it's something that I need. A lot of people always ask me, have you watched this on Netflix or whatever? I don't watch Netflix. I don't have time. I have so much reading to do. In fact, I'm always going, oh, I don't have enough time to read as much, and I'm reading all the time. And now that there's audiobooks and I can listen to them at 2.5 speed, that helps a lot. So it's always been there. I don't listen to fiction, by the way, at that speed, but I actually read fiction, but nonfiction is so easy to do. So
Mm-hmm.
it's always been there. But when I was doing graduate work, I was in England, and I discovered a Jungian writer called Liz Green, who's actually an astrologer. She's a Jungian astrologer, but she mostly writes from the archetypal Jungian level. And that was my first introduction to Jung. I'd never heard him. I had never heard his name. My graduate work I was doing in history and literature. Obviously, literature was always part of it, although I love history. History is great. Um, and so I went from reading Dostoevsky and all these great 19th century writers to Jung. What's this about? And I don't know what your experience was, but for me, it was like tumbling into something that I knew was there in the background somehow, but somebody managed to give voice to. And that in
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Campbell, you speak about the indigenous traditions. I mean, Joseph Campbell was obviously very much into that. He is the best synthesizer. I mean, look, I know there are a lot of people trying to copy Joseph Campbell, but nobody will ever reach the level that he did. He was just
Mm-hmm.
fabulous. And one thing about Joseph Campbell, unlike all the other people, the people we're listening to right now on that's showing up as the modern day Joseph Campbell types, is that he did a lot of his research. He went to these places, went to Japan, he collated, he did work that I think very few have done. So he's still probably, for me, the gold standard, and I discovered him at the same time. So these are people that sort of drew me into that world. And yeah, no, I obviously you feel the same, but once you connect to it, My problem, I don't know if you have this problem, you have to tell me, is that I really can't stand conversations that don't take me to that level anymore. So I make for a very bad dinner guest. You're going to be, because I'm going to mention the Frog Prince or something like that, because I'll get bored, right? And
Hmm.
so the usual conversations people are having, which I think are valid in certain contexts, just don't. That's why I have a group. I need to be able to feed that part of me.
Hmm.
And, the whole social media world has allowed me to pick up members that are, I mean, my co-hosts right now for my gatherings podcast is in Madrid. It's incredible who you can connect to, which you didn't used to have the opportunity to do so. So it's just been great in that regard. Also, I don't know how you feel about this, but the ability we have to find material that was hidden so long ago. I
Hmm.
mean, it's there. It's on YouTube. It's people recommending books to each other on Goodreads. It's Reddit. There's so many places you can go to have a community, to find a community, because even living in a city as large as the one I live in, it's hard to find people who are really that interested in this the way I am. Do you not
Yeah.
find that? And even a place like Arizona, which is really,
Well, I think just the interest in ideas and then having really deep curiosity in whatever direction it
yeah,
is, like you have to seek out certain people that will fulfill that need. Because I have lots of friends who we're going to talk about
yeah,
different things. But it really is important to feed that like stimulus, that need for that intellectual stimulus on whatever that topic may be that you're deeply curious about. And you go further than like I was an extroverted kid. I got in a lot of trouble. I books were like my secondary, and then over time I started getting really into ideas and things like that. But if you're deeply like someone like yourself who's constantly reading, obviously you have this like really deep drive to learn and to take in, and so it's going to be hard to find people that have have that level of intellectual curiosity, and especially on the same subject of things that are going on within the soul.
yeah,
Jung
yeah,
is like I kind of wanted to, and if you have a train of thought, please feel free
yeah,
to
yeah, no
go
problem.
back to it. But I wanted to get into one of my other favorite teachers, and I know that you recommend him. James Hollis is
Oh,
very interesting. So I
oh,
have his.
so, oh, sorry, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I just have his book in front of me, A Life of Meaning.
Yeah,
He is a really good synthesizer of Jung's
yes, yes.
teachings.
Well, he's a Jungian, he's an actual Jungian analyst to begin with. So there are a lot of people parroting Jung who didn't go through the analytical training, who don't have experience in the context he does. Because you can call yourself a psychologist. To become a Jungian analyst takes a lot of years, and it takes you doing ongoing Jungian analysis yourself. Honestly, Dylan, he is the wisest voice alive. He is.
Hmm.
So in 2010, when I started the whole Sophia journey, I brought him to Toronto to work with my group for a weekend. And it was so easy to sell out an auditorium, by the way, at the University of Toronto, because he's really well known in the Jungian community. He is such a wise and just lovely human being. He's got
Hmm.
38 books published, right? I mean, amazing. I always say to people, skip everything and just if you want to learn about Jung, just pick up his books and start with the inner city books. Especially, there are a couple at the beginning, the Eden Project, which I think everybody who wants to have a relationship should be reading the Eden Project. It's actually the
Hmm.
book that launched my group, by the way. This is the book I made everybody read. But
Hmm.
he is so deep. And part of why he is so good as an elder, he's like the ultimate elder we all want around, is that because his background was he was a professor of English literature, he's able to bring in a lot of references to very deep thinkers already, and be able to create stories, and then bring also the stories from his own consulting practice, where he tells you. But there's another thing about him: he also gives you information about his own life, and he's a very
Hmm.
humble man. One of the things I really admire about him is when he's tired, and he said to me, when we talked here in Toronto, he said, I'm an introvert. I really don't want to be doing this. I want to be with my wife. He was in his 70s then. He said, I want to be my wife. I want to just spend my time that that's for me, not for. And he just lost his son not that long before he came. He lost his 38-year-old son just before he
Hmm.
came up to Toronto. So what drives him, he said, is that he sees a need, and he sees the
Hmm.
people want to hear him. And he says, I put on my jacket and I just show up. And I thought, wow, that takes so much courage. It's so easy in grief or whatever, just to, say, okay, well, I now the time is for me. And so I'm completely overwhelmed by the man. I think he's probably the best voice right now out there. And because he has published so much, And a lot of times people will say, well, I just bought this book, but then it seems very similar. It doesn't matter. Every time you read one of his books, you are taken back to the things that matter yet again. And by the way, the other thing he does, which I love, he's not selling you bromides. He's not saying things are going to be fine tomorrow. You have to work at it. The word he uses more than anything else is responsibility. How to be responsible to others. And in a world which seems to be lacking a lot of that, I just look at him and I say, that's the voice we need as a counterpoint to the idea that it's all about me and my journey, what I want. So I have nothing but good things to say about him. And I think we're privileged to live in a world where he's still there speaking and putting himself out. Yeah. How did you find James Hollis, by the way?
So he did Andrew Huberman's podcast. I
Right.
think I'd come across his books before, but then when I listened to him, there's a lot of books out there. So sometimes it just gets brushed in where I'm like, oh, I don't, I'll get to it. But when I listened to him on Andrew Huberman, he was just excellent. It was one of the best podcasts I've listened to. He was on my friend Ryan Anderson's podcast as well, and it was phenomenal. And he's just like, and so then I read one of his books and I was like, okay, this guy is able to teach in such a clear way. I wanted to ask why was the Eden Project, that's called the Eden Project, right?
Yes,
I actually haven't
Eden
read
Project.
it. Why was that so powerful for you and for that starting that group?
So I knew a lot of the members of my group were women. So I knew that the women tend to be a little bit, or I shouldn't say, but there is that idea that women are much more geared towards understanding or needing to understand relationship, or more geared. But honestly, I think men are as much as women. And so I knew it's a book that's going to upset some people because he takes the whole concept of romantic love and he dissects it and he tells you what's really going on. And for me, it's a wake-up call to people to take responsibility for their own stuff before they try to get together with somebody else. So it's not only about relationship to the other, like your partner, but it's also relationship to other aspects of society, from religion to what kind of God you want to. It's very, very profound. And I would put it at the top of the list. And I've found others who have had the same history I've had. I used to see Hollis would come in a lot to Toronto, so I saw him speak quite a few times. And that's the one book I would start people off on, just because I think if you can get your relationships right, if you can start taking away your projections on partners, I think that's already going to start healing the world, because we tend to expect so much of the partner. Now, he's not the only one. The other writer that I recommend him, James Hollis, can be a little bit, I have given him to people that find him a little bit more complex that they want. So there's another Jungian writer who is not as he's a little bit simpler to understand. And his name is Robert A. Johnson. And he wrote a whole bunch of little books that you can pick up. And I always recommend He, which is one book, She, which is another, and then We. And they're very small, but he's very, very simple. He does not get weighed down by jargon. And yet again, he tells you how to approach the feminine in yourself. And that's she, the masculine, he, and then we is the relationship side. So all of these people are trying to be guides in areas that we are all too often, the culture gives us a view of what they should be, and the culture is kind of destroying them at the same time, which is what Hollis says in the Eden Project. If you think a relationship is a rom-com, it's going to be pretty hard to deal with what a relationship really is, right? And so he takes apart that whole thing slowly, brick by brick. And I mean, some people I had a friend years ago who I recommended the book, and she said she threw it across the floor. And I said, oh, I guess you don't want to give up your illusions, right? And yeah, I think a lot of us would rather hang on to our illusions than grow. Right. So
yeah, we get deeply ingrained with that rom-com programming. If like this you're going to find this perfect man or this perfect woman, and like they're going to transcend all the other bullshit in life. And I find it is harmful. I'm still trying to navigate these things. And what themes though from these books do you feel like they kind of start to tear apart? Is it help with not projecting? Does it help with addressing the feminine feminine and masculine aspects?
Both. I mean, I think the projection is really, really important, because shadow work and landing. So people have this really weird notion of what projection is. It's all bad. It's not. It's how we locate who we are through the vehicle of others, through the vehicle of what art we like, music, whatever. We're always finding ourselves in our encounter with the world. And so these books guide us into what it is, to drop the judgment around it, and to also locate what groups are we villainizing because we ourselves cannot stand that in ourselves. So it requires a lot of honesty, which is why I think a lot of people don't want to do this work. It also shows you that you're probably projecting your gold, which is something we don't talk enough about. So if you're
Mm.
envious, I think envy is not a bad thing. Envy tells you I want something, right? So if you're envious of a musician or a speaker or whatever, all it's telling you is that's what I want to be doing. So then
Mm.
the next step is, well, how do I do that, right? And so I think these books are great guides that way. On the issue of the masculine and the feminine, I tell you, Dylan, the one thing that will drive me crazy is when I post anything about those two words, the kind of nonsense that comes out, the responses, the kind of anger. And I just realized, man, you guys
Mm.
don't even know what you're talking about. So what the Jungians did very well is they tried to tell you, listen, masculine, feminine, stop making this about gender. It has nothing to do with gender. These are qualities that are expressed in every human being in different quantities. That means a woman can be very much more masculine oriented and similarly, but they're qualities and they both need to be attended to and they both need to find balance, right? And so
Mm.
what they're telling you, what they're actually doing is to get you away from all the language stuff that's happened around there and people
Mm.
misusing it and being quite nasty with it and saying, okay, well, why is this setting you off? See, one of the things I like about all of this work is it's always going to, and by the way, in my 5-hour meetings, I have to say my group is so incredible at being honest with themselves about why they're being set off. And one of the things
Mm.
that I ask you to do is, hey, I don't have the other person in the room. I don't care what the other person did. Tell me what in you is reacting to this stuff, because you know that you'll have two people in a room and one will react one way and the other one will react in a different way to the same thing, right? The same comment. And so we want to know, what is it? And what Hollis and all of these writers point out is you're reacting due to personal history. That's all it is.
Mm.
A script, right? Somebody, I don't know if you've heard about, there are people that hate the government, for example. Well, the government's a great stand-in for a parental figure. If you've had maybe a difficult time with a parent, it's easy to project a lot of your dislike on an institution. Why? Because maybe confronting a parent's a lot harder, right? Maybe,
Mm.
whatever the reason may be. So what I like about all of them is that it requires a lot of personal honesty and responsibility. And I don't see a lot of that in the world. So I think what I see is a lot of people through politics or whatever saying, well, it's that group or it's that person. It's like, okay, stop.
Mm.
What in you is reacting to all of this, and how can you make it better? And at the heart of Hollis is a great deal of compassion and a great deal of maturity. And that's a word, honestly. You see a lot of old people with no maturity. He's the opposite of
Yeah,
that,
the responsibility is definitely key, and it's really difficult to take. We want to offset responsibility onto other
Yeah.
things and other people, but I think that has to do with being an adult. And I was curious if how familiar you were with like the notion of the Puer
Oh,
Aeternus.
very much so.
And I want you to maybe share some of your perspective on that, because that is a concept that not a lot of people talk about. And I get worried. I was reading through some of Marie Louise
Oh, yes.
Von-Fronz, and I'm like, damn, like, I mean, I'm still, I just turned 30. So I'm
Yeah.
like,
So you're
I want
young.
to,
Yeah.
well, I want to be, but I want to be mindful. I always wanted to be mindful. Like, how can I not stay in this, like, especially in the culture that
Yes.
um, celebrates not growing up and celebrates this idea of allocating responsibility. So can you elaborate on the Puer Aeternus a little bit and your
Yep.
familiarity with that?
I have to say, first of all, my hat's off to you that you're actually addressing this. I think that you're 30 and you're actually hitting that point. That is very, very good.
Thanks.
A lot of people don't get there for a long, long time until they have the midlife crisis, and then they do all sorts of things. So it is a problem in the culture. And of course, Marie Louise Von-Fronz wrote the book. There's another great book on it. It's in my bookshelf somewhere, called The Peter Pan Syndrome, and it's
Mm-hmm.
by a Jungian analyst named Anne Casement, I believe. I will send you the link after. Both of these things refer to the inability for us to, and the word is responsibility, to really make a decision and take the reins on our own lives. So the classic way it shows up is you never commit to a career, you never commit to a relationship, you never commit to anything, a certain path, because at the heart of the Puer Aeternus is the fear that when you commit to a path, all the other ones disappear. So it's
Mm.
the child's need to have everything all at the same time. And we as a culture love promising you can have everything, you can do this, you can do the other thing. The eternal youth will always run away from responsibility because it is a settling down. And I think what they confuse settling down is like, I am settling for this, right? But there could be something much greater in the background. Now, I'm going to tell you, I was exactly that. The female version is Puer, but it doesn't matter. It's the same idea. And I think that's my 20s were all spent running around England, back and forth. I could not commit to one path. It wasn't until I was in my PhD program and I thought, what the hell am I doing? I mean, honestly, I was in this really obscure history of medicine program, which, trust me, you can do very little with after. And I was sitting in London going, okay, what, and of course, reading everything I shouldn't be reading, even though I loved my subject as well. And then I realized, yeah, that's my problem. My problem is I really don't want to settle into a path because, and so I left the PhD program and I came back to Canada and began my writing career. And even then it was like, oh, should I finish that PhD? And at the back of my mind, it also took me a lot longer to commit to a relationship. So I was under the same, and I think women and men can be, affected equally in this, although we often talk about the puer and more than the puella. But all of it is deep down an inability to want to grow up. It's so much
Mhm.
easier to stay in the Peter Pan phase and say, well, tomorrow. But there's a certain liberation in taking that step once you do. And it's so weird
Mhm.
to explain to people. You think it's all great when you have all this choice, but actually it is in the commitment part and working at that alters everything. But scary. It's a scary thing. I can see why.
Mhm.
But the fact that you are addressing it is fabulous. Like I said, it's one of the biggest issues I see. And I'm careful with my own. I have two young sons that, well, not young so much anymore. They're older. But this is one thing we talk about. And it's the idea that for all that we think there's a better thing out there, it's all in our heads, right? This is all
Mhm.
like the mind spins all sorts of things. So here's an idea for you. Um, what I say to the people in my group and what I tell myself is, one of the best lines I think I've read is the cure for longing is the longing itself. So I think what people are doing when they're doing this, and I did, so I know this, okay, is that we're trying to find a feeling state, okay, through
Mhm.
all of these choices we're making. But what if the feeling state is just coming into contact with your own body enough that you're feeling it, like you're really feeling it without the story, without narrative? That's number one. And number two, is it possible that the power of story, the power of art, the power of any kind of a transcendent experience, whether it's in a church or whether it's in an art gallery, is that maybe you can have those choices mediated and given to you through that vehicle, so you don't put them on people and destroy their lives.
Mhm.
And so I think that's why stories matter, right? Why women read romance at a crazy amount. They are recreating something they cannot find on a consistent level because nobody. This is what the Eden Project is about. You think you're going to be in a relationship in the romantic phase beyond a certain period of time? You're crazy. That's not what it's
Mhm.
there for. Okay. And so there are
Mhm.
ways, and I think this is where art is really valuable, where you can live those experiences, understand it. They can be cathartic. They can make you understand things about yourself, where you don't have to put it on another human being. I don't know if that works for you, but I found that this is a thing that mostly works for me. What do you think of that?
Mhm. I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that sometimes experiencing again a piece of art or a book that's just incredible, it'll give you a level of an experience that you're not having to take from someone else or take from the world.
Yeah,
And I think that that's so true with relationships. And again, there's still a lot of immaturity around relationships in terms of people love that infatuation stage of like, and that's more of an addictive clinging
yeah, yeah,
than it is about like deep seated love. And I do find the more grounded I get, the more I experience things in a deeper way that are separate from that idea, not
yeah,
just in relationships, but in other things too that are just outside of that idealization.
yeah, yeah,
And I don't.
yeah,
So I think I don't know. I think what's cool about what you do as well is just getting people like tapping people into these stories, and there is this imaginative realm and spiritual realm, let's say, behind things, or psychic realm that we don't our culture doesn't value, and we're going to continue to
no,
see the side effects of that.
yep.
Speaking on that as well as, can you maybe for people who are just maybe unfamiliar, can you tap into and talk a little bit about addressing shadow elements
Right.
of ourselves, our
Right. So I
collective
mean,
shadows.
I can only tell you what through my own work with shadow work and obviously what I've read. So the shadow aspects of ourself, again, we go back to projection. They are good, both good and bad. We tend to only talk about how we project all our evil qualities onto people out there, but we also project a lot of our gold. I tell people that if they want to learn about shadow work, the book I always recommend, because it's very, very small and he's so entertaining, is Robert Bly, the poet, wrote this book called A Little Book on the Human Shadow. It's very small. And he's a poet and he tells this great story. This is where I think the honesty of people really is what gets us there. So he's this poet, everybody goes to hear him recite his poems, but poets don't make a lot of money. And he found himself kind of resentful deep down that, he was hanging out sometimes with business people who would come and see him, and they were quite wealthy. And there he is, reading his poems. So he's at a party, he says, and a cocktail party. And this businessman comes up and says, "Oh, I love your poems, Robert. I love them." And he's thinking in his head, write your own damn poems, right? And then he thought, wait a minute, why am I saying that? And he realized that he was resentful. He was resentful towards this man who was participating in a system that, let's face it, rewards businessmen more than they reward poets. And he decided, well, this person's going to take the fall in his head. I don't think he articulated the thought he had. And I thought that was so interesting because in that he said, I was able to face my desire to have money. You see, the artist, the poor artist thing, it's like a trope, right? Everybody's heard about it. Operas were made in the 18th century about the artist and the garret. But what if you resent that kind of? And I know a lot of artists and they would like to get paid the way other people get paid, but they generally don't, right? And so what he was expressing, which I thought was really great, is the desire, which sometimes in the arts world is like, oh, well, money doesn't matter. Actually, like for everybody else, money in an existence does matter. And that's the kind of thing he's talking about, that to catch yourself in that moment in your head when you are resentful. Is it because, am I resentful because I want what that person has? Same thing with admiration, why do I admire that person? We go back to what I said before, because perhaps I want to do the same thing they are doing, and yet I don't feel I have the talent or the luck or whatever you want to call it, right? And so it's the best way to get to know yourself. And when there's also another fabulous, I mean, I could recommend so many books. You got to stop me because I'll just go on. I'm ridiculous. But ultimately, shadow work is done by observing what is triggering you at any moment and to be very honest about it. It's really easy to say group A, group B, person A, person B is a villain. And, and by the way, there's an objective reality too. There are some people that do a lot of harm. So I'm not saying you go out there and you allow your neighbor to come over to your lawn and start, being aggressive. That's not the point. You can have an objective and a subjective reality. You know what I'm talking about. There is a type of person that probably sets you off, because we all have types of people that sets us off. And what I love about seeing people on the internet being set off is they're telling me a lot about themselves. They're not telling me about the person they're criticizing. I'm going, oh, okay, there's your shadow. Because why is this so upsetting to you? Why this particular thing? And then you'll see public figures who keep doing this. And then to me, that speaks volumes. And I'm going to tell you, if someone is trying to dispense wisdom and behaving like that publicly, the wisdom is gone for me. Because for me, when you do your shadow work, you're integral, you're integrated. That is why I respect James Hollis, because you won't see him do that, because he is a very mature human being who doesn't feel the need. He can catch himself, right? I'm sure he has his opinions or whatever. He doesn't feel the need to broadcast them because he is speaking from a much deeper level. So for me, shadow work is the very first step you take, and it requires really, really deep honesty. And the other thing, Dylan, do you do any dream work?
Not so much. So of course, like I pay attention to my dreams, and then
Okay.
I try to understand them for myself. I actually don't typically write them down or go really deep into it, and maybe I should start because my dreams are always wild. So
Okay, so there
I
you are.
try.
So that's my recommendation. So part of what I do with my group is I was trained by somebody who taught you how to do dream work with groups. And so specifically, the Jungians are not particularly into this. They want to do one-on-one. But to be honest, a lot of people can't afford Jungian analysis. It's expensive. So I trained with somebody who, having done myself a lot of Jungian analysis, we could work. And I have to say that if you're a novelist or an artist, you understand the metaphorical universe pretty well. So you're good at making connections, which is what's good with dreams. So part of what I do in my group is everybody brings their dreams. Okay. And
Mm.
I can tell you that is the fastest way into this whole thing, because your dreams in the Jungian worldview, dreams are compensatory. If you are totally up here, like you're high in the sky, like the classic dream where you're in the airplane and everybody goes, "Oh, it's so nice, you're flying." Well, in many ways, when you're flying like that, and it depends, the context of the dream is very personal to you, so you have to work with it. But often when you're having those flying dreams, you're really not grounded. There's something about you that needs to get grounded. And so sometimes those dreams end up in a crash. And so when you're working with those dreams, what you're realizing is they're generally a product of whatever was imbalanced a couple of days before. And if you're watching carefully, you start really understanding what's driving you. In my case, honestly, when I'm right now incubating a new novel, they're also very good at telling me where I'm encountering myself. Because the other thing I tell people is if you can write fiction, and you don't have to publish it, if you can write something in fiction form, it is so interesting what comes out of your mind. It is like everything is you, right? Just like in a dream, the biggest mistake people make is they have a dream and they say, "Oh, I'm dreaming about X person. That is X person." Not usually. Usually it's you. So what you have to say is, what do I associate with that person that really belongs to me, right? One good thing about doing dream work is that precisely when you start asking that question of your dreams, then you start asking the question of people you meet, right? You realize, or
Mm.
you're interacting with, well, it's not them. Maybe it's me. My reaction is really what's important here. And so you pay attention to that. And that's why I say to people, it is the easiest thing to do, because you just write them down. And if you're having them already, then that means your psyche is really activated. And I have to say, Dylan, because you're reading people like Hollis, when you are doing these kinds of, when you're delving into this subject, you will get more dreams, because your unconscious is saying, "Oh my God, he's listening to me. Let me go in
Mm.
there." And the only thing to remember is a couple of rules. And Von-Fronz was really good with this. I wish imagine having her to analyze your dreams. There's this great series that sometimes gets uploaded to YouTube called The Way of the Dream, where
Mm.
she basically talks about dream work, and it's quite amazing. She analyzed like 80,000 dreams or something. And
Mm.
honestly, it's the fastest way in. It is really fastest way. The other way that I find is actually through story again. There's a type of psychiatry where people get together. I happen to know a practitioner of this who it's a very weird form of therapy, but it's really good, and it'll get you reading great literature, where they'll sit down and read together, the therapist and the client, the something like the life of Ivan Illich, which is a really great little novella that shows you a lot about meaning. And then through the vehicle of discussing that novel, okay, you get what you get is the person's where they're at will reveal itself to you very quickly. So there are
Mm.
many ways, but all of these things are about engaging with the unconscious. How much time are
Mm.
you giving? You give so much time to going out and whatever, doing extroverted things. How much of our time per day is given to engaging with ourselves, so with our inner lives, with our inner images? And I think that's what's missing, which is what the whole purpose of my group is, to give a space where people can engage with their inner lives in a way. Like, I don't really care. And what's funny about my group is we've been together years. We don't know a lot about each other's external lives. It doesn't matter. It's so boring. But the inner
Mm.
lives, that's what we discuss. And that's so fascinating. I highly recommend it.
And that's what really drives your life too, and the work,
Yeah.
like the outer world. Look at how much suffering we have going on and how much
Yeah.
chaos is
Yeah.
largely because we're not addressing
Yep.
the inner stuff. And yeah, the dream work I will tap into more, because it's a direct contact with the unconscious. And I think a lot of the world is reaching for that,
Yes.
and they're kind of taking like the ladder instead of the steps, because sometimes dream work or breath work or meditation are good ways to start tapping in, but it seems like they want to bypass that and go right for the
Yeah.
psychedelics.
Yeah. Yeah. I
And
know.
I'm not
It's not going to
I'm
work.
not opposed.
No.
Yeah, and I'm not opposed to that, but I know that if you're going from your workaday life where you've barely addressed anything about yourself, and then you want to have a heroic dose of mushrooms, or you want to fly and take ayahuasca, like, you might tap into stuff that's just not your psyche's just not prepped for.
No, I mean, I've been following the work of David Nutt started in the UK in Puer College, and I can't remember the guy who's written and did a lot of the early studies. There's a lot in healing, and especially with proper guidance, that is very powerful there. I'm not denying it, but the risks are there as well. Rick Strassman, who did all the work on DMT, tries to remind people of this. This is not a one-way street. But what I do see is what you've just mentioned, a lot of spiritual bypassing. So I did a lot of meditation in my early 30s. That's actually what really helped balance things. What I tell people is, well, I started then, I continue to practice of some sort. I did it with the Sufis, but you can do it with so many other people. What I tell people is that one thing we all have to remember is that you can do things in more. We have this weird idea, this fundamentalism around paths. So, well, I will do meditation or I will do psychotherapy. I think it's not an either or. I think you probably need to do both. You need the mindfulness path, and there's really great research to support that. And then there's the other path, which is I don't think you can get away with just doing the mindfulness or the meditation. And you see, and you know this, a lot of shadow issues coming up in these communities where they're great meditators, and yet we find there's tons of abuse, sexual abuse and other abuse. Why is that happening? Because the shadow issues have not been addressed by meditation. And so I think if you do both, and maybe more than both, maybe psychedelic therapy actually is part of it. It's the idea of isolating, because I think what we're looking for, and this is based on the model of healing we've had, that there's one solution to everything. It's either a pill, or it's a session with a psychedelic, or it's a therapist. I think all of these things are necessary, and they're different for everybody as well. Some people will find that something helps for them, and other paths don't. But what I think the whole thing is telling us is that there is a lot of need for it. And you just made before a very important comment. When you don't do the inner work, we project it and make a mad world, and we'll be making a mad world for millennia now. It's not like it's the first time. But what Jung lived through with the First World War, and when he had those dreams that led to or when he did the active imagination that led to the Red Book, is he saw the outer world reflected in his own inner world. And what we're seeing is a lot of kind of that madness. That there's just this kind of complete chaos, as you say, which is not a bad word, by the way. Archetypally, chaos is where everything comes from, but you need it balanced again. Everything is about balance. And so you need it balanced with a little bit of order, but don't go crazy over the order. So always we're trying to hold these two things. And so, yeah, I really appreciate what Jung said. He said, look, do all the political stuff you want, go to peace rallies, do whatever, but don't forget that the work starts with the individual. And that is the only thing that ever changed. And I'm going to add another story, which I think is really important. There's a Jungian / well, she actually worked more with Joseph Campbell. Her name is Jean Houston. And she, at one point, became the caregiver for Margaret Mead, who was this very big name anthropologist, 20th century anthropologist. And Houston had gone all over the world with Margaret Mead to learn all about different cultures, very isolated cultures at times. And so when Margaret Mead, who had no children at the end of her life, she's on her deathbed, and she said, Jean Houston had been taking care of her, and she says, come here, Jean. And so Jean goes and thinks, oh, I'm going to get the meaning of life just before she dies. And Jean Houston said, Margaret Mead said to Jean Houston, forget everything I told you up to now. And Jean Houston's thinking, oh, great, I've been wandering around the world with you. Now you're telling me to forget it. But she said something that has always stuck in my mind. She said, the only thing that will help the world are small teaching, learning communities that will be formed by people doing the kind of work that you're doing, anybody who's involved in this. It's the idea that that's where it starts and that's where it probably ends. You can project and have these big gurus and they're intellectuals, sure, whatever. But it all goes back to the individual. And often, in what I've seen in my own group, doing work with a bunch of really dedicated individuals who are dedicated to, let me just not project my stuff onto somebody else, let me not create children who are not integrated, who are afraid of the feminine or masculine. I mean, this seems like such small work, but it is so massive. And if we could all do it, I think, yeah, we'd have fewer representations in the outer world of the kind of craziness we see. But try to get people to do it. I think the problem with this is that because we live in such a materialistically oriented world. And when I say that, I'm not even talking about the fact that everybody wants to be wealthy. That's not it. That we only believe in things we can touch. We're very, very, and we can see that to tell people that there is an inner life that is so much more powerful than you could ever could think of unless you contact it. I think it's hard for a lot of people. I guess I'm lucky that as a novelist, I engage with it all the time. So it's like I'm always making stories, right? So I think, oh yeah, okay, that's interesting. So how do we convince people of that? I don't know. That's the big question.
Yeah. Well, the part of the lack of ritual too in that like growth process is just we're not really tapped into that anymore,
Nope.
which is probably why we are seeing the prolonged adolescence in people as well. And then just a lack of spiritual meaning, something deeper than ourselves. I wanted to go into that a little bit. I feel like Jung's, I forget the name of the book off the top. It's really prophetic though. Like the first chapter, I think it's not Modern Man in Search of a Soul, but the one where he's talking more about politics. You might know it off rip, but he's talking a lot about the individual and the mob mentality and kind of how, like, if you have a society of de-individualized humans, they're just going to band behind
Yeah.
flags and banners and
Yeah.
statements. And we
Yeah.
still see that collective psyche
Yep.
really just drive people in that mob mentality. And
Yeah.
it's hard. We're talking so I can express it, but it's hard to express to people that I don't believe in an individualistic culture so much. I believe that we should exist
Yeah.
together, but I believe we should psychologically be integrated enough to be an individual, because
Right.
otherwise you're gonna, if you put a list of political beliefs or religious beliefs on a checklist, and it was like, if you're a Republican, you believe this, and if you're a Christian, you believe this, or if you're a Democrat, you believe
Yeah.
this. If you can list out for me my political beliefs based on an association, a group association, then I don't believe that I'm an individual.
Right.
And a lot of people are like that, and they're
Yeah.
walking through the world like that. They believe what is part of the collective of their group, and
Yep.
that group think is causing us to
Yeah.
butt heads. So
it's very hard, because the thing is that we find safety in groups. We don't. What Jung calls us to do is to be who we're meant to be, and that means getting rid of a lot of the ideas your parents had about you. That's already a big problem, right? Because maybe your parents wanted you to be a lawyer, and you decided, no, I'm not following that. So there's just so many levels to this, and what our society thinks, and what our society values, and so we start following whatever someone is telling us to do, as opposed to finding, well, what really drives me. One of the questions I always ask people is, what are you really passionate about? What really jumps out to you? And, some people, like my husband, loves birds, right? So he'll notice birds. And until I met him, I didn't know that there was more than one bird. So I look at him and I go, wow, that is this form of meditation. He goes out and he goes, wow, this is great, this world. And that's what really makes me feel like I know the individual. Where is their attention mostly geared towards? There are a lot of people that think their opinions give them safety or give them validation. And, unfortunately, all these opinions are often, they reside in the political realm, which is the muddiest realm you'll find, because power is what's there. That's, so what power structure do you want to fall into? So Jung, I think this is where we go back to. And I think what you were referring to, he wrote a very prescient and at the time and very important piece called Wotan, which I think is collected works. I don't know which part of the collect, but it's an essay on the dynamic that was happening in Germany just before the Second World War, and how people were projecting onto this figure all sorts of things that resided really in the archetypal world, and that basically was taking over the collective mind. And so one of the things we always have to ask ourselves is, where am I being taken in by the collective mind? What is it? And why am I driven to that? And, a lot of this deals with, again, parts of ourselves we're not really comfortable with. So we'll locate it in the other person, and we'll say, well, that group or that person or whatever it is. And so we go back to the shadow work, and that's what you have to do to be able to claim it. But yeah, no, individuation means you are an individual. You are true to yourself. And that does not mean, and Hollis and Jung and all of them go out of the way, that doesn't mean you're selfish. It doesn't mean you want to be like this selfish person. It means I will no longer take a part of myself I'm not comfortable with and put it on you, Dylan, because you happen to be with me here. And I think, oh, you kind of look like the part, that is what we shouldn't be doing. And that is what's happening all over the place. And it's not just in the United States. It's happening here. It's happening in Europe. There's this incredible need to find a villain. And now, okay, that's a great narrative story, by the way. A villain is always there. But what if the villain is in you? What if you have to what if you have to face the fact that there is no villain? The only villain is the one you have to contend with in your own psyche. Well, how many people are brave enough to actually look in the face, look at themselves that way, to say, oh, okay, well, what parts of myself are in exile, And sometimes the parts that are in exile are the ones that are going to save you. In fact, I'd say they're probably the ones that are going to save you. You might have an artist in exile. You might have, but you look at, but you don't have the confidence, or you fear you'll be laughed at. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is how many people don't take chances in the artistic realm because they fear they're going to fail. And to me, that's just a failure of the imagination. Take it anyway. Fail better when you next time. So there's a lot that we can retrieve, but it does again require you to be extremely honest. And I think that honesty is really hard to come by. And, where you'll find it is, if you keep having the same type of relationship where you're damaging people, and or you're allowing the damage to happen, or you're in situations where you keep, this is the classic, the person who has the relationship with the same type of delusional character or drunk or whatever, then you've got to really look at the drunk in you. And when you tell that to a person, they'll say, well, you're victim shaming. No, you want to take back the power in your life. And the only way you're going to take it back is if you admit that a part of you is a drunk. Now, you don't have to be literally a drunk, but maybe the way you're drunk is that you are drunk on the idea of romantic love showing itself in a certain way, right? And so, it does require a lot of work on yourself. And yeah, I can see why it's hard for people. But honestly, the people who do, and I see it in my own group, in my own environment, their lives are immeasurably better. They're still not great and like perfect. Well, great they may be, but they're not perfect. But the perfection problem is a big one, and we're not going to get perfect, but we're going to want to be whole, is what Jungians always say, which means incorporating aspects of ourselves that are in exile.
Very interesting. It seems like a lot of it goes back to asking yourself questions and then finding the answers to those questions, because we're talking like James Hollis, he repeats multiple times, is just like, what is trying to enter the world through me?
Exactly.
Not like what should I do? What should I do is one question, but what is trying to enter the world through me, and then create from that space. And we all have this perfectionistic idea of like creating, and then if we can push that aside, it takes a lot of time sometimes, but if we could push that aside and be like, you know what, I'm going to just do something, I'm going to create something because I have that deep desire to, no matter what happens from it. So that's the expression of your books too. You elect to write and create and do a group, and it's fascinating. I was curious, like, so you went to school, correct? You did like 2 years. You didn't do the actual analyst program?
No, so the analyst program is very strange. So what you need to do is get 200 hours of analysis. I had that. You can't even apply until you have 200 hours of analysis. At the point where I had that time under my belt, I just was publishing my second novel. I was doing some touring. It was a hard time, but I also recognize that's not how I'm oriented. So I don't think I want to work one-on-one with people. And that's what an analyst does. I'm not an introvert. I'm introverted in my orientation in terms of I love reading, but I really do like a different type of canvas. And so at the time, and by the time I was in Toronto, there was a good association here. My own analyst wanted me to go to Zurich. Well, my kids were, they were one and 1.5. I wasn't going to abandon my kids, and my husband could not go with me, so it wasn't going to work. But ultimately, I think I did it the way that worked for me. So for me, I was teaching a lot of this with an organization that I was with, because what happened with me is I would go into analysis and I would spend most of the time not talking about anything in my life. I would be wanting to talk about the collected works of Carl Jung, and she'd be like, okay, Bea, this is ridiculous. You're coming in. And it's like, I have nobody else to talk to about this. And so that's where I started the group, and got people together to discuss what I couldn't, find another way. There should be graduate schools for people who are just trying to learn about these things without necessarily going to universities, because I think there's a real desire for it. And so I took a lot of courses at the Jung Institute, tons of them. I did workshops with people like Marion Woodman, obviously saw James Hollis, brought James Hollis to Toronto. So I did a lot of that. And I created my own thing. Like I thought, no, I don't want to be part of this or that group or whatever. I've always been pretty independent. And that's how I created Sophia Cycles. I registered it at that time as just an organization. And then I put up the website, and slowly then the social media part of it came in. And, with my group, we do collective events. We have a Sophia Collective where we do dream work for people. They have to be connected to our group still. I don't do, dream work is very vulnerable. Like you're putting people in situations where they're revealing, so we do it in a kind of limited way. So and members of my group are, some are in Jungian analysis. Certainly they're all great readers like I am. They're interested in the subject matter. So the way I did it is I just decided I'm going to create my own model here. And it's really worked for me personally, because it's the kind of thing that really appeals to me. And everybody does it their own way. Being a Jungian analyst would take, from that moment at any organization that you have it, probably about 5 to 7 years. It's a tough program. It's good for some people. It's the right way. I had been in graduate school so long, I just thought I cannot face another program of study, and I was trying to publish books, and writing is hard, so it didn't work for me. It wasn't my thing.
Yeah, especially if you're not trying to work one-on-one with people, it's not
it's not worth it. No.
Yeah, but it's still cool that you have all that education and that background, and just being whatever the hell you're interested in is really what matters anyway.
Yeah.
It's not so much like what that's stuff that I learn as I get older too. It's not so much like everyone's path is different, and we have to follow what we're interested in. You can't force yourself into a box that you're not going to fit in, you know?
And we're also living at a time where can access so many great teachers so I'm teaching a course. I should talk about this at the Jung Academy, which is a great organization put up by Gary Bobroff, who had gone to Pacifica with a bunch of people, and he gets artists and Jungian analysts and from all walks of life who are teaching this material. And I'm teaching something called the archetypal Venus. I'm taking the feminine and trying to, through story from the first earliest poems we have right to the fantasy novel. Well, how are we seeing the concept of Venus, which is very much tied to the feeling function in the Jungian world? And so I'll be teaching a month-long class for him online in February. So there's lots of organizations now who are giving you this information, who are providing it. And so I don't think anybody has to take the usual route. First of all, you won't find it at universities because universities are not very good places for Jung. They're very weird about Jung. In fact, I heard a guy on Instagram the other day going off on about Jung. He's a psychologist, and I thought, you have no idea what Jung even wrote. This happens all the time. A dismissal of Jung because Jung touched areas like mysticism, which really scares the hell out of a lot of people. So he's just dismissed out of hand. Although I think he's making its way more into it. But anyway, so you're not going to find that kind of work there mostly. And so but there are tons of places you can learn, you can discuss with other people. And so what I'm seeing is what Margaret Mead saw, that there are teaching learning communities that are being created not only in living rooms, but online, where people can discuss this through the vehicle of podcasting. A lot of people are discussing it there. And so what I say to people is, what do you want to create? What community do you want to create? And so I'm going beyond the political and saying there are communities of this nature that we might need more right now, which will take us beyond and maybe help solve some of those other problems. And so what I tell everybody in my group is form your own group. Like, let's keep this going. Let's do this. This is Sophia cycles. Let's keep it cycling so that we have little groups getting together to decide, yes, here's the thing. I want a deeper conversation. I want a conversation that allows me to explore subjects that were once explored in a church for many. Church doesn't hold the same symbolic import for many of us. And so these are the same kinds of subjects because they're meaning subjects, but we can speak about them in a modern way, in a way that speaks more to ourselves than any structure that is out there. And for some people, that structure works. And look, glory to you, do whatever you want. For me, it didn't. And that's why I needed to create a place where I could have these conversations outside of the mainstream.
It's incredible that a lot of universities are dismissive of Jung, and even like people that learn from him and teach him. I don't know what they're exactly going for. Of course I know that there's like hard scientific ideas and there's different psychologists that I think are brilliant, but the idea that we should just get rid of this deeper realm of psychoanalysis is pretty nuts.
Well, it's also not happening. People are not getting rid of it. You're seeing it through the back door in so many places, right? So
as it should.
Yeah, exactly. So when you try to get rid of something like this, it does come in through the back door anyway. Part of the problem is Jung ventures into areas that academics. So my son did a cognitive science degree at the University of Toronto, and one of the guys there, and he part of those guys that were fantastic at teaching these areas, but one of them was talking about Jung one day online somewhere in a program, and when they got to the issue of Ion, the book Ion, they kind of got nervous about it because Ion talks about the precession of the equinoxes, which is an astrological term. He's talking about astrological ages. He's talking about this archetypally. He's talking about it metaphorically. If you understand enough about what he's speaking about, you shouldn't be jumping over it. It is actually an important part of what he talks about. And so there are areas like that they feel diminishes them if they speak about them. A, they don't understand it, I don't think. And B, I don't think that you can dismiss. You have to look at the whole thing. You can't say, well, I'm going to take this piece and I'm just going to chuck the other one out. See what he's trying to say to you. So the latter works that he did, which are all post his heart attack that happened in 1944 when he was mid-60s, they're the really challenging but very interesting work. One's on Alchemy Mysterium, which is mind-blowing if you read it. You got to read it carefully because it takes a long time, which include all the crazy dreams that the Nobel Prize winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli had that he took to Jung. Fascinating, okay? The other one is Ion, which is this idea where he really explores he explores a whole bunch of things, but it's a later work. And then the other one that's very controversial but also extremely powerful is Answer to Job, where again, he takes on this issue of good and evil in a way that totally ticked off some of the people he was corresponding, Christian ministers who never forgave him for it. Just fascinating, fascinating works. But they really stretch and demand something of you. They just, he's a philosopher. A lot of people talk about him as a psychologist. He's a philosopher really influenced by 19th century philosophy, whether it was Goethe, right straight through. You can see the lineage. Goethe, Nietzsche, it just goes right to him. And if you're aware of what was influencing him, people talk about him and Freud. He and Freud broke up very early on, and he was more a colleague than a student. I don't think it's right to say that he was a student. Although, of course, he really took the concept of projection, came from Freud, but he took it to a new place. So if you understand what influenced him, you'll understand a lot about him. But the thing that most influenced him was the Red Book. And what did that come out of? That came out of his own confrontation with his unconscious from 1914 to about, 1913 really, for 3 or 4 years, where he did all this inner work, where he kind of did a novel, right? He was meeting parts of himself, some parts which were really scary. He thought he was losing his mind. And then out of that came his whole philosophy afterwards. So it was that direct confrontation with the unconscious. Now, what do? Can you quantify that? Can you measure it? Can you add it? See, that's the problem. And so what psychology has become is a language of measurement, not of the soul, which is what psychology means. Psyche is the soul, right? That's gone. That's told. James Hillman talks about this all the time. We wrote about this, that we've lost that contact. And so, so you can't expect it in the academic world is extremely conservative. Everybody talks about how they're liberal. Yeah, but they're also very conservative. Nobody gets in. Nobody gets in if they don't want you to get in. There's like a big, and then, trends come in and you can study this guy. Now, what's really interesting? That a lot of the cognitive scientists, a lot of the work being done in brain imaging is kind of proving what Jung had to say. So I'm thinking, this is really cool. Let's just keep at it and we'll see, that what he had to say, what he intuited. This is why I like the work of Dr. Ian McGilchrist. He is basically articulating something much more, now that we have so much more in terms of evidence of what Jung had to say early on in the 20th century. So, people will do whatever they want to do. That's why I didn't return. I thought of, for a couple of years, I thought of returning to finish my PhD, but do it in the area of Jungian studies. There's a couple of universities out of the UK. Exeter had a program. And then I thought, for what for? Like, what am I doing here? Who am I trying to prove something to? And I have nothing to prove at the end of the day. I think the idea is you can be guided by books. Joseph Campbell had this moment in his life during the Great Depression. He had dropped out of a PhD program like I did in Paris. He was in Paris at the time. And he came home and there were no jobs because it was the Great Depression. So he decided to go into a cabin, right? And for 4 or 5 years, just read. One book led to another book, led to another book. He said, I didn't need much then because nobody had much. I just needed a little bit of food to survive. And that is how he developed himself, and all you do is you read the footnotes and you say, okay, where is he getting this idea? You could do that with Hollis, right? Oh, he's now quoting Blake. Oh, he's now quoting Faulkner. Well, who are these guys? And that is a pretty big education. And you don't need a stamp from a university to tell you that it isn't, or that it is. When you're going through that, you're developing this incredible sense of how the world is connected. And so to me, it doesn't matter.
Through practice. Sometimes through practice is just more powerful, whether that be books or like anything for that matter. Like if you want to learn how to surf, you got to get in the water. You can't read it in a book. So it's just like you can, and you might understand the tides a little bit, but no one's going to prepare you for standing up on a wave.
Although I would say that the writing, the book, the reading, what Joseph Campbell said applies to me. He said his religion was underlining sentences, and that's my religion too. I believe that
100%, and that wasn't even to take away from books. I just mean like having the institution tell you something doesn't, because reading books that's how I learned almost everything other than, or podcasts and but yeah. I have one last question. Okay. I mean, I want to see if there's anything you want to leave with people, essentially with like your words. Is there something before we go in terms of like how to nourish your soul, or if there's just some message you feel like sharing with anyone before we wrap it up for today?
Honestly, just initiate a conversation with your inner world. And you can do that through the vehicle of tell yourself some stories. I mean, you know what I do with my group, which maybe people want to try? I tell them, I want to hear about your life, but you have to condense it to 2 or 3 pages, and it has to be in the form of a fairy tale. I don't want to hear I was born to... And it's amazing what will come out of that little practice. Because when people have to do that, they have to think archetypally. And suddenly something weird happens. And we've done this once, and I want to go back to it. And I was amazed at how powerful it was. People tell you the truth. I once did a reading with another fiction author here at a book festival, and he stood up and he said, history tells you the facts, fiction tells you the truth. And I think that when you create it is the same thing. Weirdly, you are telling a truth that you can never tell by biography. Like, I don't care about writers' biographies. I really don't care. When people go on about it, I don't care. I want to know, what have they written? Because what they wrote tells you so much more than any, he was born here, his parents were there. It doesn't matter. What did they leave behind? And so ask yourself that. How can I initiate a conversation with my inner world? You can do it through dreams. You can do it through storytelling. But just have that conversation. And then, there are many guides out there who are fantastic. Jung was definitely a guide. James Hollis is my favorite guide. If you're going to find a wise elder, he is it. There's nobody probably more powerful than James Hollis, but there are many others. And let them guide you. And then the other thing is, pay attention to what you love. Just like you should be paying attention to what you hate, because that's too extreme, and maybe you'll find what your shadow is. What you love is as important as that. And don't dismiss it. A lot of people are kind of, oh, I shouldn't love this. Why do you love it? I mean, if you love stamp collecting, it may seem odd to other people. Well, what is it? Is it the collecting? Is it the fact that you love symbols? I mean, there's so many ways to look at it. And finally, notice what other people love as well, because that tells you a lot about what they're about.
Well, thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you. I'd appreciate you taking the time out.
Thank you, Dylan. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. Remember to like the show, follow, subscribe. I'm available on YouTube and Spotify. Thank you.